Hey everybody, this is Steli Efti with Closer, and in today's video I want to talk about startup to startup sales, right? So we all know about B2B, B2G, B2C, but what about S to S? S to S? Is that a thing? Startups to startup? So here's the idea, right? Many startups, if not almost all startups that I see that are trying to sell to other businesses, the first type of business they are going after and are selling to are typically other startups for a variety of good reasons. So I wanted to record this video and share some best practices, things to keep in mind, how to do it right, and how to think about it strategically so you get the best results and the best returns on your efforts selling to other startups. So first of all, why are startups leaning towards trying to sell to other startups in the first place? Why is this a trend? Why is this a tendency? Well, the easiest answer is that it's easier to sell to startups as a type of business out there if you're a startup than to sell to almost any other kind of business, right? Number one, you understand who these people are and how these organizations operate because you're running a startup yourself. B, you're going to be able to communicate with them in a language and with a lingo that they will understand and speak fluently back to you. C, startups are a type of business that moves really quickly, which means that they typically will make decisions very fast. They are small in terms of their organizational size. Usually, it depends on what stage you're selling to. If you're selling to startups that are kind of seed stage versus Series A, Series B, Series C, whatever. But in general, they're much smaller teams, so the decision-making cycle is much faster. But on the flip side, they oftentimes have they can have, let's just say it that way, they can have really big budgets. Many startups are bootstrapped, but there are a ton of startups that are venture funded or that have angel investment or any kind of funding, which means that for their history, for the amount of customers and revenue they have, for the size of the team, they might have a lot of money in the bank compared to any other type of small and medium-sized business out there. It's fairly easy to reach them and to communicate with them, right? So startups, oftentimes, they have their information out there. It's fairly easy to figure out who the founders are, and if you send an email to those people, the chances are good that you're going to get a response. If you call, which is something we used to do at Elastic Sales when we were calling startups to sell them our outsourced sales team for startups, one thing we realized is when you call startups, many times they would pick up the phone because they don't get that many calls, right? Or a founder would pick up the phone, even at smaller teams, less than 25 or less than 50 people, because again, it was not that typical for people to call them. So they didn't have as many defense mechanisms, as many gatekeepers as large organizations or other types of businesses. And oftentimes startup founders will be in the office all day long at their computer. So you send them an email or you call them, you might reach them. It's not like another type of small business owner that might be, in the kitchen when they're running a restaurant or running around purchasing, like just not being at a desk at a computer at close to a phone at all times, right? If you think about the typical especially tech founder, it's somebody that's like on their phone or at their laptop a significant portion of their day and week. So it's much easier to reach them and their information is all over the place. It's easy to connect with them on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn. These people are easy to reach, easy to communicate with, and then their team size makes the decision-making cycle quick. The other thing is they're very technical, right? They understand technology, so they're able to purchase technical products much easier. They're able to implement, integrate with technical products much easier than large organizations. And it might be a lot more forgiving, right? If you have bugs or if things are not perfect, they're comfortable buying from you because they don't have any trust issues and they don't have that much to risk, right? They're not in a position of somebody that either doesn't understand technology, doesn't understand startups, and therefore is afraid of it, or somebody that works in a large organization and has a job and their main priority is job security. So using a small company as a vendor might be a real risk to their career. Like they don't have all that baggage. So they're comfortable buying from startups. They're technical in using a startup product. And although they're so small, they're pretty influential, right? A lot of times startups and other founders are, people that influence other business owners or people within their network in terms of what technology is about to be next, what's the hottest, coolest new tool. So they have influence and they have audiences a lot of times way beyond just the startup ecosystem. They might be influencing many other business business decision makers outside the startup sphere. So it's a pretty influential group. You sell to a startup and they use your tool and they talk about it everywhere. They write about it in blog posts. They mention you at conferences and other places. You might get a lot of buzz going and even get customers that are outside the startup bubble. And the founder to founder connection is really strong, right? If you reach out as a founder to another founder and you ask for 50 minutes of time to get feedback on your product to explore if there might be a mutual fit, you can be really honest. And it's going to be hard for many founders to decline that request because they can remember a time just months ago where they made the same request to other founders, right? So they have a high level of empathy and they understand you and they want to help you. If they're successful, they want to pay it forward because they were helped, just like you were asking for help before. So it's a great way to start selling your product. If you want to sell your product to another type of business, and if you're thinking about SMB, in the long run, starting with startups as a type of SMB can be a really powerful way to do so, right? Now, there are some ways to keep in mind when it comes to like how to do this in terms of how to market and how to sell to startups. And we've written a lot about how to do sales in general, and I'm going to link up to some of the fundamental reading you should do for that's going to benefit you when you sell to other founders as well. But the one really beautiful thing that I mentioned already is that founders are easy to reach and startup information is plentifully available out there. There's many places where you can get startup data for lead gen purposes, right? There's the MetaMarks of the world. There's the Crunchbases of the world. There's many websites and places out there where you can get accurate information about startups. You can get, startup events and be updated on that, like your recent funding rounds, which startup has closed another round recently. That could be a good piece of information to know who has money, who sees success, who is growing. You could go to places like AngelList and get a lot of information about hiring, information about funding and any kind of other information about startups, but also when they're hiring, what type of people they hire, and that can be an indicator of what kind of tools or products they might need to purchase soon. So there's tons of places to go out there to do lead gen and get intelligence and insights on who to go after and who could potentially be a good customer of yours. And then there's many places where startup founders and startup people in general are spending a lot of time at, right? Places like Hacker News, places like Product Hunt, places like growthhackers.com. There's many Facebook communities, places that are very vibrant where you can share content, where you can share product announcements and feature announcements and get community feedback, as well as keep an eye on who else is launching new things and who else is sharing interesting content and data to connect with and communicate to. So there's lots of places to market where the audience in front of you are other founders and other startup teams and startup people. So it's a beautifully focused space to market to. Now, when it comes to how you want to do marketing, how you want to do sales, I'm going to keep this short. As I said, I'm going to connect you with some startup sales fundamentals in this video to some other materials that we have out there. But the basic thing that I'll say here is you want to keep it as bullshit-free as possible, right? I know that every market has its bullshit amount of bingo and buzzword and we talk about the startup bubble and how like startup folks are a little like out of whack and out of touch with reality. But one thing I can tell you, especially with technical startup folks, which a lot of them are, is that you can't use as many big words that don't have any meaning or lack specificity than you can in larger organizations. And it's the same thing is true with other small and medium-sized businesses, especially like small businesses like restaurant owners or other types of businesses like that. You can't use buzzwords, very, words that don't mean anything. You can market and sell your product in a way that's very like lofty, which is something you can do and sometimes you're required to do when you sell to very large organizations. But when you sell to other startup founders, you want to keep it as clean as possible, as specific as possible. When you talk to other technical founders, you need to be technical yourself, or at least understand the technical side well enough to not bullshit, not overpromise, and not be ambiguous or broad in the way that you speak. Founders will see through it, or my experience is that other startup founders will have a much stronger sense for being bullshitted than the typical business SMB folks. And so when you don't know, you say you don't know. When you are able to do something today, you say you are. And when you're working on a feature, you say you're working on it with, not a determined ETA on when that feature is going to ship. And you don't try to bullshit your way into getting their money because they're going to see through that. All right, so the things to keep in mind. There's a bunch of things that you should keep in mind here that are important. Number one, startups, on the flip side, what's negative about selling to startups, right? Well, one thing that's negative is that a lot of times they have a lot smaller budgets than massive organizations and businesses. So your customer acquisition cost will have to be fairly small. You can't be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to acquire a startup customer. Because on the flip side, not just do they have usually smaller budgets, but they are also churning at a pretty high rate, probably similar as other SMBs, maybe higher, I'm not even sure. But they're going to churn also for a variety of reasons, not just for going out of business, but in many cases also because they had made a hard pivot and now they don't need your product anymore, right? Today they were a marketing automation software company, and tomorrow they're a children's online gaming community. So they might need it. They might have a need for your CRM today, and tomorrow they don't need a CRM anymore, right? Whatever the case may be, the churn is going to be pretty high, budgets are going to be lower, and so you can't afford a super high customer acquisition a budget to get a customer like that. And you need to be aware of what your average customer lifetime value is going to be with those startups, right? Pay great attention to how long they're staying as a customer and how much money you're making, how much money you're spending to acquire them. Now, the other thing that you need to keep in mind is that a lot of times on the plus side, startups will give you maybe very hands-on advice, maybe very technical advice. They'll give you really great feedback and be comfortable giving you feedback very early on. All those are positives. On the negative side, a lot of times startups will give product feedback based on what they think they will need once they're successful. But then once they get to that size, in general, things just change so fast that what they're telling you they absolutely need might be the wrong thing, or might be something that is not going to be true 2-3 months down the line, right? Things change much faster, which also means that the things they're telling you they need from you, if you go and build them and come back, you might find that they don't, right? Oftentimes startup customers will ask us for features or things, and then we tell them we don't have it. And a month or two later, once we check in with them again and we ask, hey, do you still need this? And they go, no, I thought I would need it, but we don't really need it. Or on the flip side, sometimes we deliver what they wanted. We say, hey, now we have this big thing you really needed a year ago. We released it. We're super excited. Are you excited as well? And they tell us, you know what? I thought I would be excited, but things have changed and we thought we need it, but we don't really need it, right? So you need to be really careful and selective on what kind of feedback you take on board. You can't be heartbroken when the things they told you they absolutely need today are things they don't care about anymore tomorrow, since their situation has changed so much. Now, one big question that's out there is selling to startups just a stepping stone, or is it a long-term strategy? Well, it used to be absolutely just a stepping stone, and no way would anyone ever even consider only selling to startups. That seemed crazy. Today, the situation has changed a little bit, right? There's so many more startups now, and startups as an organizational structure for small and medium-sized businesses is much more prevalent. And I have a hard time, I'm not a futurist. I don't know what the world is going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years, but it's hard for me to believe that that's a trend that's going to stop. It definitely feels a little bubbly in terms of how many startups are popping up around the world. But again, if I think about it long term, do I believe that 5, 10 years from now, we're going to have more conglomerates in the world, more companies that are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old? Or do I believe that the type of businesses that are going to be more winning in the marketplace are going to be smaller, newer, faster changing type of organizational structures? I'm definitely leaning on the second one. So I think that it used to be an absolutely no-brainer that startups were just a stepping stone to SMB and eventually to enterprise. But I think today, I still believe that just selling to startups is probably somewhat limiting, although that is a growing market. But today you could sell to startups and make millions and millions of revenue every year, which is something in a very sustainable way, which is something that I think was harder to do even a few years back. But I do think that still it's a good idea when you want to sell to SMB to look at startup as one part of the bucket and probably a great first type of SMB to go out there and acquire. But I do think that many B2B SaaS companies will want to think about how to expand from there. I do believe that the future of business looks more and more like startups look today, right? Very technical, small, agile, fast-moving, fast-paced. So when you sell to a customer that has these kind of characteristics, I think you are designing a service in a company that serves to the future of business, which is a good thing. But I do think that that's a healthy thing to probably not just sell to startups, right? But that's just my personal opinion. I think that on the bad side of things, a lot of times when you sell to startups, especially if you sell to startups that have lots of funding, you're going to be doing really well when the funding market is bullish, right? When lots and lots of startups get hundreds of millions, you're going to be making a lot of money. But when the funding markets dry up, it might mean that you're going to get really, really killed out there in the market, and it's going to really impact you. So I wouldn't want to just sell to venture-backed startups and especially sell really large contracts to venture-backed startups. That seems like a crazy strategy to me, very volatile. But selling to startups, especially when you have like bootstrap startups around the world, you're going to be impacted by funding cycles. Things are going to go up and down, and you need to be aware of that. But I don't think, again, it's as big of a deal as it used to be. But you need to keep an eye on the funding cycles because it affects startup cycles. On the flip side, there's a unicorn jackpot that you could have selling to startups that you could never have if you sold to any other SMB, which is, think about companies like Twilio, for instance. Twilio is a great example of a company selling to other startups. And one startup they sold to was Uber and Airbnb. And the massive unicorn success of Uber and Airbnb made Twilio a unicorn success in and of itself as well, right? Because Uber scaled to whatever, trillions of SMS and calls and all that through their app. Twilio benefited from that growth massively and became $1 billion business themselves and went public. I think it's $1 billion business. So when you sell to a startup that's exploding, you might explode with them, right? And that's a little bit like a lottery ticket, but it is an interesting circumstance that's not attainable in any other type of sale, especially when you sell to other SMBs. Something to keep in mind. So back to the fundamental question, is selling to other startups a stepping stone or a long-term strategy? I think today it can be both. It can be a stepping stone. I think it can be much more midterm, maybe not long-term. But what's important for you, if you know that you want to sell to larger companies than just startups or other verticals and markets, or if you know that even the most extreme example, you want to grow into enterprise sales eventually, you need to be aware that the feedback and traction and metrics that you're seeing today from your customers will not translate one-on-one as you grow your business, which is actually true for any kind of type of business. So you need to be aware of that and pay attention to the numbers that you're seeing, the metrics, the KPIs that you're seeing early on as you're selling to other startups. Those won't translate once you go to other markets or sell to other types of businesses. So don't just take those metrics and project them up as you're thinking about selling to bigger and bigger businesses. Things will fundamentally have to change. Your business will have to transform itself as you want to grow to different type of markets. But if you keep that in mind, you should be fine. All right, so I hope that was useful and valuable. Make sure to shoot me an email, steli@close.io. If you have any feedback or questions, make sure to go to blog.close.io and subscribe to our blog. And until next time, let's go and get them.